Oh boy, I rarely get to piss off two fandoms simultaneously. People who love the Vampire the Masquerade tabletop game and people who love this video game adaptation. Now don't get me wrong, this game isn't getting out of this review without a recommendation at the end. I'm not going to shit all over Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, so you can put those wooden stakes away. But I expect that every minor mistake I make here will be ripped to shreds by fans, because I know how defensive people can get when someone doesn't express the exact amount of praise for something they like, especially if it's something that's considered a cult classic. And man, Bloodlines is a hard game to like. But before we dive into Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, let's set the stage a little. This is one of those games that gets heralded as one of the greatest games of all time, usually by a small but very vocal crowd that usually tends to trumpet the greatness of a few other supposed cult classics that almost nobody has played. Well, I say almost nobody, but that's probably not strictly true. Even though the game only sold 80,000 copies during its initial release window, causing the developer to go bankrupt as a result, Steam Spy currently estimates that between 500,000 and a million people own the game on Steam. So there are a decent number of people who at least own it these days, but there's no denying that Bloodlines had a very rough start. In fact, Bloodlines had it rough way before that. It had a very troubled development cycle given the massive intended scope of the game when contrasted with the available resources. One of the creative leads claims that most of the nearly 4 years of development time were worked under crunch. Apparently, the development team also didn't have a producer for nearly a year, and stuff reportedly got out of hand during that time. It also suffered from the fact that it was developed on an early version of Valve's then new Source engine, which came with its own troubles. Apparently, Valve didn't want to let Bloodlines steal the limelight away from Half-Life 2 by releasing earlier than it to introduce the world to the Source engine. So even though the game's publisher Activision set multiple milestones that Troika Games couldn't meet, the game would still get delayed until Half-Life 2 was ready. When Valve experienced a security breach in 2003 where source code of the then in development Half-Life 2 was stolen, that caused further delays. And if tying the release of your game to the release of an entirely different game wasn't enough, the final insult came when Bloodlines was released on the same day that Half-Life 2 came out, right next to other high-profile titles like Metal Gear Solid 3 and Halo 2, which meant it kinda got lost in the shuffle. Since then, the game has gotten a lot of post-release support from fans, which was desperately necessary. The turbulent development meant that the game that was shipped was in essence incomplete. As of right now, there are 2 fan patches available that people recommend. The first one restores basic functionality and makes the game playable on modern systems. The second patch actually restores some of the cut content of the game. I personally played it with the basic patch because I felt that in order to fairly critique the game, I needed to stick to what the developers actually delivered, regardless of what fans eventually made it into. So what exactly is Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines? Well, its origins as a tabletop role-playing game means that the video game adaptation is also an RPG. However, I would actually argue that it's not just a mere RPG, since it comes dangerously close to immersive sim territory. The game does have fairly obvious roots in classic RPGs, given that at the very start of the game you get to choose a specific character class that determines what types of unique vampire powers you get to make use of during the rest of your adventure. Your character class also directly aligns you with a specific vampire clan. That's mostly pretty standard for RPGs. You've got a range of gameplay options and just divide them up between classes in hope that each of them results in a somewhat unique gameplay style. But what makes Bloodlines really interesting is that the choice of class also impacts a variety of other aspects. Some classes have unique features. For example, the Malkavians are insane, so their dialogue is markedly different from everybody else. Therefore, for them, dialogue isn't just tied to however many points you've put into skills and attributes that raise your speech-related feats. Another class that behaves wildly differently are the Nosferatu. They're inspired by the vampire from the film they're named after, so they are quite heavily disfigured. So much in fact that they can't roam the streets of LA without being attacked, so they mostly have to stick to the sewers to get around. Stuff like this obviously allows for a lot of replay value. Are you going in as a thug who solves their problems with violence? Would you rather use stealth and evade all your problems? Or do you want to talk your way out of trouble? That's basically the goal that Troika set themselves with this game. And anyone who has played other immersive sims knows how much fun games like these can be that offer a variety of ways to solve any problem. Unfortunately, Bloodlines doesn't quite reach its lofty ambition, at least not for the character I intended to play. When I started the game, I took the little quiz at the beginning that told me that the best fit for me would be a Ventru, basically the aristocracy among vampires. They're less inclined to fight and prefer to do things either from the shadows or through conversation, which is how I personally also typically like to play immersive sims. I enjoy mostly stealthing my way around obstacles and talking down enemies to avoid combat entirely. It's not that I don't enjoy combat gameplay at all, but if a game gives me the option between doing it like every other game does it, or if I can avoid it entirely, I usually like to take up the challenge. For the most part, that worked quite well. I did have to struggle with the stealth bit during the tutorial at the beginning, because for some reason enemies can detect you even if they don't have line of sight, and crouching apparently also isn't silent. But after I put a few points into stealth, I could literally crouch walk right in front of enemies without being seen, which is hilarious. You'd never see stealth implemented like this in a modern game. It's clear that many of the levels weren't really designed around stealth at all, because they often don't feature ways to sneakily infiltrate something. So I love the pragmatism of basically making you invisible if you're crouching and not sitting right below a light source, provided you've spent the necessary points into sneaking. There are actually clans that have the power to turn outright invisible, but the regular stealth worked well enough for me to get through quite a few locations completely unseen. Where the game really shines though is in the dialogue department. There are a lot of characters you can talk to in this game, and a lot of them offer quite a bit of sharp writing. It's fairly obvious that most of the dialogue is pretty linear and follows the same script regardless of what dialogue option you pick, but both your options as well as their replies are written cleverly enough that they allow for some flexibility of interpretation. And I love how the characters really feel like characters and not just dialogue dispensers that are supposed to move the plot forward. Though unfortunately there are a few that definitely fall into racial caricature territory, and quite a lot of women in this game are extremely sexualized. In fact, the whole game seems to have a fairly horny attitude in general. It's not entirely unwelcome. Vampires are traditionally very much tied to sex, and in fact Bloodlines deals with mature themes way more gracefully than many games even today. But stuff like the black dude with an afro selling stuff out of the back of his truck, the Chinese arms dealer in full military uniform with the staccato speech pattern, or a lot of the women having their tits hanging out really rub me the wrong way. Not to mention that one quest where you get rewarded with quasi-nude posters of some of the women you encounter during the game to hang up on your wall. But let's get back to the gameplay. Unfortunately, you can't just talk or sneak your way through this game, and where in my estimation Troika dropped the ball the hardest was in the combat department. You have two primary ways of attack in Bloodlines, melee and firearms. Melee combat really lacks in finesse here. It just seems like something that you can't master. There's not a lot you can do besides whacking enemies with whatever weapon you've got. There's no real dodging or maneuvering outside of walking either, so getting out of the way of enemy attacks is often a fruitless endeavor, and you'll just have to rely on the points you've put into your defensive stats. But what really took the shaft here in my opinion was the first-person shooting. I mean, this game was built on an engine specifically created to make one of the greatest shooters in history, for crying out loud. But the shooting in Bloodlines feels extremely underwhelming. Guns are all slow to use, and because it's an RPG, if you haven't put any points into ranged combat, it takes ages for the targeting reticule to shrink so you can manage to hit something. Now I get that my shooting in this game was never going to be world class because I didn't put a ton of points into it. But even if you start the game with the intent to use guns, it's going to be a bad experience for quite a while until you put more points into it. Now as I said, that wouldn't be a problem if the game allowed you to just sneak or talk through everything and just not bother with the combat at all. I would have loved that. But unfortunately, this is where the tempestuous development becomes very noticeable. The first half of the game is pretty damn excellent, but it gradually gets worse over time. You have a total of 4 main hubs all over Los Angeles that you can freely explore, each unlocking along the way once a main story mission sends you there. The first two, Santa Monica and downtown LA, are pretty damn great overall, with a lot of stuff to explore and tons of little side quests you can find, many of which don't feature any combat whatsoever and often rely more on deductive skills, exploration, and talking to people. And their respective main quests are also varied and interesting. The sibling rivalry between Jeanette and her twin sister Therese is great, and it has an amazing conclusion. Similarly, the haunted house mission was a great bit of survival horror that really stuck out positively in my mind. The third hub, Hollywood, is overall pretty decent, but also noticeably smaller and less dense in questing opportunities. And it also includes probably the worst sewer level I've ever played. If you haven't heard of this or encountered it yourself before, sewer levels used to be fairly common back in the day, and they were always always terrible. They often turn the game into a prolonged maze with tons of repeated enemies or boring puzzles to drag out the runtime. Now, I mentioned before that one of the vampire clans actually requires to traverse the sewers for a big part of the game because they get attacked on sight if humans see them in the streets, so I have to make a distinction here. The regular sewers used to travel underground and reach a few of the buildings that can only be entered from the sewers are completely fine. They're sensibly laid out and not infested with random vermin that you constantly have to kill. No, what I'm talking about are the so-called warrens below the regular sewers in Hollywood. You get sent there as part of a main story mission involving a snuff tape that got produced by the boss of a vampire group called the Sabbat. I'm not going to delve too deep into the lore behind the game here with all the different clans, sects, etc. because finding out about this stuff is half the fun of the game. But anyway, the boss of the Sabbat, this ugly motherfucker, has the ability to make flesh and bone malleable and create weird monstrosities that get used in said aforementioned snuff tape to tear apart a woman fleeing from them. Once you defeat him, you gain access to the warrens, which are supposed to lead you down to the Nosferatu. Only this place is littered with these creatures, most of whom are incredibly tough to take out if you're not specialized in combat like I was. And the only thing you need to do down here is find your way ever deeper until you find the hiding place of the Nosferatu. So it's mostly just there as a long, confusingly laid out combat tunnel with a few token quote-unquote puzzles thrown in. It just got so boring after a while. Once I managed to get to the lowest level while running away from all the enemies, and I realized that the game wanted me to backtrack up the previous section that I just made my way through to get a keycard to open the hole in the ground, I swear I almost thought about quitting the game outright. Thankfully, I got the bright idea to put a few more spare points into sneaking and just avoided all the tough enemies there by sneaking right past them. Sure, it took an eternity to do so, but it was better than attempting to run through and deal with the conga line of enemies behind me. Honestly, I was this close to just no-clipping my way to that keycard just to get it over with. If any aspiring game designer wants a crash course in how not to design a level, this is it. Things briefly looked up once I got to the fourth hub, Chinatown, but unfortunately that didn't last long because there's very little to do there outside of encountering a few of the aforementioned racist caricatures. And once you've exhausted all the side quests there, the game is ready to wrap up the main narrative, which also shepherds you into more long levels that mostly consist of lengthy linear tunnels. I mostly succeeded in sneaking around many of the enemies in this hotel, for example, but it wasn't a pleasant or interesting experience, since it was clear that the intended experience here was to fight my way through waves upon waves of enemies. And if you choose to help neither of the factions you can join, you get to take out both of their leaders. One mission is littered with highly perceptive enemies and a boatload of traps laid out for you, and ends with one of the worst designed boss fights I've ever seen. And the last mission to wrap up the game is just more of the same linear trekking through hallways filled with enemies. The progression through these 4 hubs, if you follow the main narrative, really showcases a gradual decline in quality and complexity that unfortunately mean that the game starts out really strong but gets weaker towards the end. This isn't just true for the hubs and side quests, the main narrative quest also suffers from the same problems. Bloodlines starts out with your character being turned into a vampire, so the game gets to introduce you to the world of Vampire the Masquerade very effectively. The game begins with Sebastian Lacroix sentencing the vampire who turned you into one to death because he didn't have the permission to do so. Apparently it's against vampire law to just turn anyone into a vampire. You need to fill out the respective form in triplicate and get proper permission from the Office of Population Control or something. Also, I have to go on a tangent here because every character, including Lacroix himself, pronounces his name as Lacroix, like the water brand that pronounces their name equally wrong instead of the correct French version. I'd not be too hung up about it, but Lacroix is supposed to be French-born himself, even though he talks with a British accent, so what gives? I'll just call him Lacroix to spite you Americans. Anyway, tangent over. Once you get pardoned for your crime of illegally getting turned into a vampire, there's not a lot of direction given as to where the game will eventually go. You're encouraged to go out and talk to people and to get comfortable in your new vampiric life. It's at this where the game excels at. At some point, Lacroix sends you out on a mission pertaining to an ancient sarcophagus that much of the later game revolves around. Now I need to mention a bit of lore here to explain this. Also, Vampire the Masquerade fans, if I get something wrong here, don't crucify me. I don't claim to be an authority here, I'm just relaying stuff that I found through a bit of research. Anyway, in the world of Vampire the Masquerade, the origin of the vampires is the biblical Cain. His children were also vampires, and they are the ones responsible for turning 13 additional people into vampires, which became the third vampire generation. Those 13 became the founders of their respective bloodlines, which defined the current 13 clans. And Lacroix is of the belief that one of those antediluvians, meaning those who survived the Great Flood, is in that sarcophagus. Obviously, every faction in the game is interested in that sarcophagus for a variety of reasons, so many of the quests for other leaders also revolve around it. Now, I don't want to spoil the entire narrative here by outright saying how the game ends, but I do have to say that the resolution to the narrative is extremely anticlimactic, especially considering the way the game intends to frame the escalation of the conflict between the various factions. There are actually quite a few clever twists and turns the narrative makes, but unfortunately it doesn't really lead to much by the end. I honestly felt like the last couple of hours that were filled with endless combat or very uninspired sneaking through boring level design were there because Troika really ran out of time and money to finish the narrative and flesh it out. Also, I shamelessly admit I turned on God mode to get through the last couple of bosses unharmed, because those along with the really weak endings really soured the experience for me somewhat. And that's a shame, because like I said, the game starts incredibly strongly, but the problems the game suffers from are apparent everywhere. It's not a particularly pretty game to look at, even for the time. You can tell that there's quite a bit of recycling going on with the assets during later parts of the game, and much of the level design is very boxy and often lacks a lot of detail. You can see tons of empty cabinets, for example, but nothing is ever displayed in them. While some of the facial animations are exceptional for the time, many of the moving parts aren't as polished. It seems that in order to improve performance, the game reduces the frame rate on characters in the distance, so their walking animations get really choppy if they're a bit farther away. Also, every time my own character appeared in one of the cutscenes, she looked off somehow. And not just in the sense that she's an undead abomination walking the earth. I also have to mention the audio portion of the game here. The voice acting for the most part is great. Much of the writing has a very comedic tone about it, and many of the voice actors really manage to capture that and deliver performances that truly bring these characters alive. It also helps that, as I've mentioned, this game's script really does a terrific job with characterization. The NPCs you don't get to talk to in dedicated dialogue are often copy-pasted and all voiced by the same person, so there's not much to praise there, unfortunately. And the music is also a bit of a mixed bag. I admit that this is very much a subjective point, probably even more so than anything else I've said about the game. I generally like most of the background music composed specifically for this game, but the licensed soundtrack is just cringeworthy. And I fully admit that it's just mostly me. Again, this is entirely subjective, but my musical taste lies more on the extreme end of metal, so stuff that sounds like a broken vacuum cleaner in outer space. So pretty much every time I hear gothic rock or industrial metal that plays up the goth factor and really hams it up, I just can't take it seriously. And it's not like I take the music I listen to extremely seriously. Anyone who has seen Immortal run around the forest striking silly poses while wearing face paint can't take this stuff too seriously. But the entire goth subculture just seems categorically quaint and laughable to me, as does much of the music that mostly just aims for style over substance. I get that complaining about something like that here is petty to the nth degree, but as someone who has a few years worth of experience in the quote-unquote scene, it just comes off as cheesy to me. But now I've clearly gone into rambling territory, so it's probably best to wrap up this review. I can certainly see why Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines has endured for so long, and why the people who love the game keep singing its praises. For large parts of the running time, it's a great experience. As I said, it comes really close to being one of my beloved immersive sims, and it allows for a lot of ways you can interact with its world. But it's also a very flawed game, thanks to the troubled development and rushed release that ultimately meant that it ended up not getting the love, care, and attention that it clearly deserved. And I can fully understand why people were so excited when Bloodlines 2 was announced a few years ago. Someone absolutely needs to have another crack at something like Bloodlines, a sharply written, compelling RPG that offers a lot of interactivity and a rich and complex world with fully realized characters. Unfortunately, that project is currently also experiencing a bit of trouble during its development, so I hope that history is not about to repeat itself here too much. But suffice to say that the original Bloodlines has certainly made me look forward to its sequel in the hopes that this new team will manage to realize the high creative ambition that the first one tried to capture. As I said in the beginning of this video, I do recommend Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, with the caveat that you should absolutely install one of the fan patches if you intend to play it, and you should expect the quality to drop a bit once the snuff tape mission is over. I wouldn't go so far as many fans and consider it a flawed masterpiece, but there certainly are glimpses of brilliance in there that make it all the more tragic.